Cool mechanic, kind of broken, kind of awesome.
Distraction makers.
So Cascade came out in Shards of Alara, and basically what it does is when you cast a spell, while that spell is still on the stack, you're going to reveal cards off of the top of your library until you reveal a card with a mana value less than the spell that you played, and then you get to play that spell for free.
Yeah, it's not an ETB.
No.
So you cast it, unless it's countered, it will...
It's cast trigger. It happens even if you counter the spell.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, not only is it giving you a free spell, it's also, still going to happen even if the spell's countered. You'd have to use something like like Stifle, which counters a triggered or activated ability.
Wow.
Because it effectively is a triggered ability on the stack.
Right, but even then, so you'd trigger the Cascade from happening, but then the creature still comes out.
You still would get whatever the card was.
Right.
Yeah. And way back in Shards of Alara, there was a few cards that were being played. Bloodbraid Elf, notably, was being played in like a Jund deck, which is red, black, green, mid-range strategy. But it also played another card called Bituminous Blast, which was another Cascade spell that was, and these spells were like good, but they weren't like insanely broken when they were in standard. They were pretty busted, but like not crazy busted like they are in modern.
Okay.
Where you would like play a Bloodbraid Elf, and then you'd cascade into the card like Blightning, and Blightning was like 3 damage. Your opponent discards 2 cards.
Okay.
I think. And then Bloodbraid Elf has haste. So, like, it's very aggressive,
Oh, wow.
like, mid-rangey strategy
Yeah.
that, like, you're hitting them for 3, you're attacking for 2 or 3, I can't remember Bloodbraid's power and toughness, and getting them to discard 2 cards.
Right.
Pretty good play on turn 4 or 3 if you're playing, like, a Birds of Paradise.
But you said it's Jund, so you need 3 specific manas.
Yeah.
Mana colors.
And Shards of Alara was the mana was great in that format. Like there was, I think, a 5-color control deck was in that era. Okay. So mana was really good.
Pretty easy to end up getting the mana that you
Yeah, it wasn't, especially with something, I don't remember if Birds of Paradise was legal, but I'm sure there was some kind of mana dork that, would get you there.
Right.
But yeah, so that's like the sort of initial kickoff of Cascade. And it was very well received at first. Players loved it, and it was, very powerful.
Yeah.
And then we get down the line, and we end up there's some other cards that are printed later on. Shardless Agent is one of them. That is 3 mana, and then Cascade, and then Violent Outburst is the one that ends up getting banned.
Right.
Part of the reason why it ends up banned is because it's an instant speed ability. So there's this interaction with I think it's Force of Negation.
Okay.
That it's free on your opponent's turn, right? So if it's your opponent's turn, you can exile a blue card and then play it for free. But the reason why the instant speed Cascade spell gets banned is because the interaction is I can Cascade at the end of your turn, and then if you try to stop me, I can still use this free counterspell to fight. When that counterspell is in, the intention of that counterspell was that you're using it to fight your opponent, not save your own stuff.
Okay.
So that was the well, the Cascade is still fine, but it needs to be happening on your turn, not your opponent's turn.
Okay.
So that's why they targeted Violent Outburst as the card to be banned.
I see.
But yeah, that's sort of a very brief primer on the Cascade archetype over the years. But yeah, then we end up moving forward with a new mechanic, Discover.
Yeah.
We talked about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, Discover is basically Cascade, except now it's instead of just saying Cascade, and it's the converted mana value of the card that you cascade into one less than the converted mana value. Now it is it could be a card that costs 5 to play for a mana value, but it will say Discover 2 or Discover 3.
Right.
And instead, you are able to adjust the total integer or variable of what you are essentially cascading into, which allows you a lot more wiggle room. So you can have a creature that is very, very strong, but discovers into low-cost things, or you could have a card that is maybe generally weak, but discovers into a high-cost thing, stuff like that, which is good. I think that generally that it gives them more control over the mechanic.
Right. Gives it more design space. Right?
Yeah.
You can have these anomalies in which you have like you said a spell that costs 2 mana or something and discovers 3, which would be very powerful, or you could have something that costs 5 mana and discovers 2 or something.
Right.
And maybe the 5 mana spell is really powerful or something.
Right.
It's also interesting because like in Ixalan, this has better flavor, right? Like back in Shards of Alara with Cascade, it's very bottom up mechanic in that it has a interesting sort of mechanical interaction, but like flavor wise, what's really happening here?
What are you cascading? What does that mean?
I don't know. It's, and then
should have just been called On a Roll.
Right. Yeah, it could have been called
Keep going.
Friends.
Help.
Bring your friends. But then, Discover at least has this sort of dinosaur-esque paleontology kind of flavor to it where you're digging through your library to find a dinosaur or something. Or,
I mean, even removing the whole like paleontology aspect of it, or like the fossilization of it, but like you searching for either lost treasure, through caverns, through looking for dinosaurs or species or something like that. Yeah, the fact that you are searching for something and then you find it is very cool. Great mechanic. And I think that what's really funny is that Cascade is one of those mechanics that bottom up, right, is how we described it. It's very crunchy. It's not implying anything in particular.
It's not telling that much of a story,
right?
Other than have a powerful effect, right?
Right. But you associate a different name to it. I'm sure newer players are going to understand it much better. And now it makes a lot more sense. But what I think was interesting is Cascade always felt very, very flavorful as a feeling. Like the feeling that you get of looking through your deck to try and get that one thing or seeing what's going to happen is really, really cool.
One of the most exciting mechanics I think ever made. The only one I can think that like tops it in terms of like excitement is Miracle, in that like you're just like Miracles, you draw if you draw it as your first card for the turn, you can play it for its miracle cost and get a extremely like undercosted effect, right?
Yeah.
And having that, you're sort of playing with the randomness of the deck in a really interesting way.
Yeah.
Where here you play the thing and then you get to reveal cards and you don't know what's going to pop up. At least in the ideal way ideal in quotes to construct a Cascade deck for the most fun. You're not going to know what you're going to cascade into.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong here because I'm not familiar too much with when Cascade was relevant, but I think to me it also sounds like a mechanic that perfectly crosses all the paths of the psychographics that we've talked about in past episodes. Where like I could see a Spike player wanting to play this.
Yeah.
I can see Timmy players really, really enjoying this. Johnny players could do some wild stuff with it.
Yeah. You can even see that in the design of cards that have Cascade, where it's like Bloodbraid Elf is definitely sort of a Spike focused kind of card, and then you have something like Apex Devastator, which is very Timmy focused card. You're cascading 4 times, right? In your commander deck. And then I think the Johnny archetype was probably somebody who's going to put together a deck like what we see with Rhinos or Living End in Modern, where you're like, all right, well, I'm going to cascade, but I'm going to cascade
only cascade for this one
right
thing
into
that
the
I could
card that I
cascade
want
into.
to. That's a Spike mentality too, but it's this sort of interesting manipulation of the way that this mechanic functions.
I think it's pretty uncommon for you to find a mechanic that fulfills like all archetypes in that way, though, and can be manipulated for all archetypes in that way.
Yeah.
I think it's great.
It's great. It's a really interesting mechanics. It's very exciting. I found it interesting that Mark Rosewater had this on like his top 20 or top 10 or whatever. I'm not sure if it was in the top 10 or not. His top 20 mechanics of all time. It's on the list, which I think if you look on it on the Storm scale, Cascade's a 7. So the Storm scale is a sort of, I guess, unofficial but official, like it's from Mark Rosewater, but he talks about how likely they are to reprint a mechanic. And the higher you are from 1 to Storm being the mechanic that they're least likely to reprint ever because it's super broken.
Right.
What the higher your number, the least likely you are to be used again. Cascade has a 7 on the Storm scale. So I'm kind of surprised that it came back in the form of Discover. I could see it being printed here and there sparingly the same way that like Storm is, but not that it's a 10, but it's a 7. It's pretty high up there. So something that's interesting in the argument between Cascade or Discover is that one thing that I think is very important in mechanics design is that you want a mechanic to function the same way, like every time, as identical execution as possible.
Ideally.
Yes. And there's sometimes when that's not possible, but it's interesting to see them, bring in Discover as a cascade effect that works differently each time based on the integer that they put at the end. And one example of this is banding, because banding, I'm not going to go in and explain banding. We'll do a different video on banding, but just know that we will do it at some point.
All right.
Just know that when you're attacking with banding, it functions differently than when you're blocking with banding.
Right.
Which is insane. And one of the reasons why it's probably one of the worst mechanics ever made. But anyway, we'll get to the worst mechanics ever made eventually.
We'll have to get a whiteboard for that episode.
It's
so we can draw it all out.
It's gonna be a doozy.
Yeah. We should probably talk about why Cascade is so powerful, though.
Free spells,
right? So, and I think, but that's something that I think doesn't get discussed enough. Is
it's not just that they're free too, though. It's also the interaction with suspend spells. Is that right? So these suspend cards. They printed very powerful throwback cards to some of the most broken cards in Magic, but they printed them with this ability called Suspend, which is you pay its suspend cost and then it's exiled from the game. You remove a suspend counter from the spell every turn, and eventually the spell goes on the stack when all the suspend counters are gone. And so they printed things like Black Lotus with Suspend 0, but it's suspended for 3 turns. So if you suspend it on turn 1, in 3 turns you get a Black Lotus, which arguably, maybe that balances Black Lotus. I don't know.
I think it's a smart way of going around it.
Ancestral Visions is another one that's Ancestral Recall, happens in 3 turns. So the weirdness is when you have these Cascade decks, they've been built in this way to cascade into a 0. Like if you play a Cascade spell that has 3, the mana cost of 3, and then in your deck you play no 2s, no 1s, and you only play 0s, you're ensuring that you're going to cascade into that one of your 0 cost cards.
Yeah.
And in this instance, there was a deck that used Living End, which is one of the 0 costs that is the same as Living Death, but it's Suspend, which destroys all creatures in play and then brings all your creatures back from the graveyard to the battlefield.
Okay.
And then the Rhinos one is, I think, another Suspend card that when you hit it, it gives you 2 4/4 Rhinos.
Okay.
And so that's the...
And so
that's why it's broken.
And why is it that, based off of the interaction, because I've now seen this in person. I played against a Slivers deck that cascaded into suspend cards, which I was not familiar with.
Yeah.
So why is it though that suspend cards often don't have an actual mana cost associated with them?
They technically have a mana value of 0,
right?
But you cannot cast them for 0. You have to suspend them. That's when they're in your hand, that's the only type of interaction.
But the interaction with Cascade lets you cast it immediately without the suspend.
Right. So Suspend's wording is, rather than cast this card from your hand, pay the suspend cost and then exile it with time counters on it. And then you remove a time counter each turn. So when it's not in your hand, the Cascade spell searches your library for a spell that, whatever mana value, right? And if it hits one with 0, you can then it doesn't recognize the sort of suspend ability on the card. It just plays it as a 0 cost spell that gets cast.
Right.
And I suppose they could modify that rule so that interaction doesn't work.
I'm assuming that there's other weirdness though, and maybe how other effects from off the top of the deck or exiled cards are cast. That
right. I mean, at that point, it would need to say Suspend would need to say. It would need to be an on-cast trigger or something, right? You cast the spell and then therefore it triggers the sort of like how Cascade works, right? When you cast the spell, Cascade triggers. It could be Suspend. You cast the spell, Suspend triggers, and instead of the spell resolving, it gets exiled from the stack rather than exiled from your hand.
Yeah,
that's the sort of weirdness. And now I sort of look at it, Suspend is a little counterintuitive because you look at
Suspend is very counterintuitive.
Yeah, cool mechanic, but it's a little verbose, I guess, right? There's a lot of technicalities to make sure that it can function, right?
Right. Yeah.
it's weird that like it has. We're not talking about.
We got to. We'll have a. This will be
episode.
a. This will be a smooth transition into our next episode,
Suspend.
talking about Suspend.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Well, I think that's it on Cascade, huh?
Yes.
Cool mechanic. Kind of broken. Kind of awesome.
Kind of great.